The haunting silence at Whisper Creek's old stone well was broken only by the faint sobs of Grace Jennings, her black morning dress stark against the golden prairie grass of Wyoming Territory, 1876. 6 months, a widow, and the well of tears inside her seemed as bottomless as the dark water 30 feet below. Grace dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that had long since lost the scent of her late husband. Thomas had been gone since winter, taken by pneumonia after falling through ice while checking cattle lines. Their small homestead, once filled with hope and dreams of prosperity, now felt like a prison of memories. She had come to the community well that afternoon not just for water, but for a moment away from the emptiness of her cabin. At 26, Grace had not imagined life alone in the unforgiving frontier, especially not after only 3 years of marriage. No children had blessed their union, leaving her truly alone. The sound of approaching hoofbeats stirred her from her thoughts. Grace hastily wiped her eyes and straightened her posture, unwilling to appear vulnerable to whoever approached. In this territory, weakness invited trouble. "Afternoon, madam," came a deep voice, gentle despite its rugged edge. Grace did not turn immediately. Strangers were common enough along this trail, and she'd learned to be cautious. "Afternoon," she replied, her voice barely audible. The rider dismounted, boots crunching on the dry ground. He led his horse to the water trough beside the well. "Mind if I water my horse? Been riding since dawn." "It's a public well," Grace said, still not looking at him directly. The man moved into her field of vision as he approached the well. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes beneath the brim of a dusty hat. He wasn't from Whisper Creek. She would have remembered him. His clothes were trail-worn but decent, marking him as a working man rather than one of the drifters who sometimes passed through looking for easy pickings. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. "Name's Daniel Yates, madam. Just passing through on my way to Fort Laramie." Grace nodded slightly but offered no introduction in return. She watched as he drew the bucket from the well, his movements efficient and practiced. "This is mighty fine water," he commented, filling the trough for his horse. "Better than what I've found the last few days." When Grace remained silent, he glanced at her more carefully, noticing her reddened eyes and the black of her dress. Understanding crossed his face, but he made no comment on her obvious grief. Instead, he said softly, "Grace." Her head snapped up in surprise. "I beg your pardon." He pointed to the carved wooden sign hanging beside the well. "Grace Jennings, April 1876, he read. "Your name's on the maintenance roster. You must be the Grace who maintains this well this month." She relaxed slightly. "Yes, the townspeople take turns." "It's my month to make sure it stays clean." Daniel nodded approvingly. "You're doing a fine job of it. I've drunk from worse wells owned by the government itself." Despite herself, Grace felt a small flutter of pride. The well had been dug by her late husband and other men from the settlement. Thomas had been so proud of it, maintaining it properly seemed a way to honor him. "You're heading to Fort Laramie?" she asked, finding her voice. Conversation with a stranger felt strange after so many silent days. "Yes, madam, got a job waiting there. Army needs horses broke, and that's my trade." He patted his mount's neck affectionately. "Thoroughbreds have the speed, but these Mustang crosses have the sense. Perfect cavalry mounts." Grace nodded, recognizing the quality of the animal. "My husband had a good eye for horseflesh, too." "Had?" Daniel asked, then immediately held up a hand. "Forgive me, that's not my business." "It's all right," Grace said, surprised to find she meant it. "Thomas passed last winter, pneumonia." Daniel removed his hat again, holding it respectfully against his chest. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jennings." The genuine sympathy in his voice touched her. It wasn't the awkward pity she received in town, or the calculating looks from men wondering how soon they might court the widow with the good piece of land. "Thank you, Mr. Yates." He replaced his hat and hesitated. "If you don't mind my asking, are you managing all right? On your own, I mean." The question wasn't presumptuous but concerned. Still, Grace stiffened. I manage just fine. I can shoot straight, grow my own food, and the cattle mostly tend themselves. Daniel smiled. I don't doubt your capabilities for a moment. Just seems like a lot for one person. Grace lifted her chin. I'm not the only widow in Wyoming Territory, Mr. Yates. We do what we must. He nodded respectfully. That you do, Mrs. Jennings, that you do. He finished watering his horse and looked to the western sky. I should make a few more miles before nightfall. He tipped his hat. Thank you for the water and the conversation. Both were refreshing. Grace found herself not wanting him to leave just yet. It had been so long since she'd spoken to someone who didn't look at her with pity or expectation. Fort Laramie is still a good 3 days' ride, she heard herself saying. The next water is 12 miles ahead at Cottonwood Creek, but it's running low this season. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Much obliged for the information. There's. Grace hesitated, then continued, There's a storm coming tomorrow. The cattle have been restless, and my joints ache the way they do before rain. Daniel looked at the clear blue sky doubtfully. You can see it in the clouds to the northwest, Grace pointed. Those thin wisps high up mean rain by tomorrow afternoon, hard rain likely. He studied the sky more carefully. I believe you're right, Mrs. Jennings. You've got a weatherman's eye. My father taught me, she said. He always said knowing the weather was as important as knowing how to shoot on the frontier. A wise man, Daniel agreed. He looked at his horse thoughtfully. I don't suppose there's somewhere nearby I might take shelter tomorrow. I'd rather not get caught in the open during a prairie storm. Grace knew what propriety demanded. A widow did not invite a strange man to stay at her property. But the memory of her father's hospitality to travelers, combined with the honest face before her, made her decision. My farm is 3 miles east of here, she said. There's a barn where you could shelter. I couldn't offer you the house, being a widow alone, but the barn is dry and comfortable enough. Daniel's face brightened. That's mighty generous, Mrs. Jennings. I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition. My husband would have offered the same. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders. I should be getting back. There's work to finish before sundown. May I escort you? Daniel asked. Those buckets look heavy. Grace hesitated, then nodded her acceptance. Daniel filled her buckets, then hoisted them onto the yoke she carried across her shoulders. He mounted his horse but kept pace beside her as she walked. So you break horses, Grace said after they'd walked in silence for a while. How did you come to that profession? Daniel smiled. My father raised horses in Missouri. I grew up learning their ways. When the war came, I joined up young and found myself working with the cavalry mounts. After, it seemed natural to keep doing what I knew. The war, Grace nodded. She'd been just a girl during those terrible years. My father fought for the Union. As did I, Daniel said quietly. Though I try not to make much of it these days, too many wounds still open on both sides. They walked further, the conversation flowing more easily than Grace would have expected. Daniel had a way of telling stories that painted vivid pictures of wild mustangs in moonlit canyons, of frontier towns sprouting up along railroad lines, of cattle drives and the changing face of the West. When they reached her homestead, Grace felt a strange reluctance to end their conversation. The small cabin and outbuildings looked less lonely with another person present. The barn is there, she pointed. There's fresh hay in the loft and a pump for water. Daniel dismounted, looking appreciatively at the neat property. This is a fine place you have, Mrs. Jennings. Your husband chose well. We chose it together, Grace corrected gently. We came west from Pennsylvania after the war. Both wanted to build something that was ours alone. Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. The best partnerships are built that way. An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Grace said, I should start supper. You're welcome to use anything in the barn you need. Thank you kindly. I'll tend to my horse and settle in. He tipped his hat again. Good evening, Mrs. Jennings. Good evening, Mr. Yates. Grace turned toward her cabin, feeling his eyes on her back. For the first time in months, she was acutely aware of herself as a woman, not just a grieving widow. That night, as rain began pattering on her roof hours earlier than expected, Grace lay awake thinking of the stranger in her barn. There was something about Daniel Yates that made her feel both unsettled and curiously at peace. His presence on her property should have frightened her, but instead, it made her feel protected. Morning brought thunderous skies and torrential rain. Grace made extra biscuits and bacon, then, on impulse, put some on a plate and covered it with a cloth. Donning her oilskin coat, she hurried through the downpour to the barn. Daniel was already awake, brushing down his horse. He looked up in surprise when she entered, water dripping from her coat. "Mrs. Jennings, you shouldn't have come out in this weather." "I brought you breakfast," she said, suddenly feeling foolish. "It's nothing special, just biscuits and bacon." Daniel's face lit up. "That's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in months of traveling." He took the plate gratefully. "Won't you join me? Seems rude to eat alone while you watch." Grace hesitated, then sat on a hay bale across from him. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses. Outside, thunder rolled across the prairie. "Your prediction was spot on," Daniel said between bites. "I'd have been drenched and miserable on the trail. These are excellent biscuits, by the way." "Thank you," Grace said, watching him eat with satisfaction. It had been too long since she'd cooked for anyone but herself. "This storm might last all day. The creek could flood if it keeps up." "Then it seems I'm your guest for another night," Daniel said. "If that's all right with you." Grace nodded, surprised to find herself pleased at the prospect. "It's fine. I should check the creek later, make sure it's not threatening the south pasture." "I'd be happy to help with that or any other chores. Seems only fair exchange for your hospitality." The rain continued all day. Daniel helped Grace secure loose shutters, check on the cattle huddled under trees in the pasture, and repair a leak in the barn roof. They worked well together, moving with the efficient rhythm of two people accustomed to physical labor. By evening, when they'd both changed out of rain-soaked clothes, Grace found herself inviting Daniel to eat supper in the kitchen rather than the barn. It wasn't proper, strictly speaking, but the pounding rain made the idea of him eating alone in the barn seem unnecessarily cruel. They sat at her small kitchen table, lightning occasionally illuminating the room through the windows. Grace had made a hearty stew and cornbread, and Daniel ate with appreciative enthusiasm. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal this good since leaving Missouri," he said. "Trail cooking gets mighty monotonous." "Do you ever think of settling down?" Grace asked. "Having a home instead of the trail?" Daniel considered the question. "More often lately. The trail gets longer and the winters colder each year." He looked around her neat kitchen. "There's something to be said for having a place of your own, roots somewhere." "It can be lonely too," Grace admitted softly. "I imagine it can." Daniel's eyes met hers across the table. "Were you and your husband here long before he passed?" 3 years, Grace said. "Long enough to build the house and barn, dig the well, get the cattle established, not long enough for—" She stopped, embarrassed. "For children?" Daniel asked gently. Grace nodded. "We wanted a family. Now I wonder if that will ever happen for me." "You're young yet," Daniel said, "and clearly capable. I've no doubt you could have that future still if you wanted it." Grace looked down at her plate. "Out here, a woman alone has few options." "I've had offers, but—" She shook her head. "None from men I could imagine building a life with." Daniel nodded, understanding. "It shouldn't be about necessity. The right partnership is too important for that." They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Daniel told her about growing up in Missouri, his brief time in the war, and his years drifting westward, working with horses. Grace spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her parents now gone, and her journey west with Thomas, full of hope for a new beginning. When Grace finally showed Daniel back to the barn, the rain had gentled to a soft patter. They stood in the doorway, reluctant to part. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Daniel said. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed conversation so much." "For me as well," Grace admitted. In the soft lantern light, she could see the warmth in his eyes and something more, a spark of interest that both frightened and thrilled her. "Good night, Grace," he said, using her given name for the first time. "Good night, Daniel," she replied, the name feeling right on her lips. She walked back to her cabin, aware of a lightness in her heart that had been absent for months. It frightened her a little, this sudden connection with a stranger. Was it disloyal to Thomas to feel this way? Or would he have wanted her to find happiness again? The next morning dawned clear and brilliant. The storm had passed, leaving puddles gleaming in the sunshine and making the prairie grasses seem impossibly green. Daniel was already up and tending to his horse when Grace emerged from the cabin. "Good morning," he called, smiling at the sight of her. "Beautiful day after the storm." "Yes, it is," Grace agreed, returning his smile. "Are you continuing to Fort Laramie today?" A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "I should. They're expecting me by week's end." Grace nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, you've got obligations." Daniel approached her, hat in hand. "Grace, he hesitated. "I've enjoyed these days with you, unexpected as they were." "As have I," she admitted. "I'll be at Fort Laramie for at least 6 months. The Army's contract runs through winter." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I was wondering if I might write to you." Grace felt a rush of pleasure. "I'd like that very much. And perhaps when I have leave I might stop by on my way through, if that wouldn't be imposing." "It wouldn't be imposing at all," Grace said softly. Daniel smiled, relief evident in his eyes. "Then I'll look forward to it." He glanced at the sun. "I should get on the trail while the day is young." Grace nodded. "Let me pack you some food for the journey." While Daniel saddled his horse, Grace prepared a bundle of cornbread, dried beef, and apples. She wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth, aware that she was putting more care into this simple act than was perhaps warranted. When Daniel was ready to leave, he stood beside his horse, looking at her intently. "I want you to know, I wasn't looking for this when I stopped at that well. Whatever this is between us." "Neither was I," Grace said. "I'd almost stopped looking for anything at all. I'm glad I found you, Grace Jennings, and I'm glad you spoke my name, Daniel Yates." Impulsively, he took her hand and pressed it gently to his lips. The touch sent warmth spreading through her. "Until we meet again," he said. Grace watched him ride away, standing in her yard long after he disappeared from sight. For the first time in months, she felt something like hope taking root in her heart. True to his word, Daniel wrote regularly. His letters arrived every few weeks, carried by the mail service that connected the scattered settlements and military outposts. Grace found herself looking forward to them with an eagerness that both surprised and delighted her. Daniel wrote of his work with the horses, the characters he met at Fort Laramie, and his growing desire to settle somewhere permanent. Between the lines, Grace read his growing affection for her, mirroring her own feelings that deepened with each passing week. In her replies, Grace shared the rhythms of her days, the cattle growing fat on summer grass, her vegetable garden's bounty, the repairs to the cabin roof. She found herself imagining Daniel there beside her, helping with chores, sitting across from her at meals. The loneliness that had become her constant companion began to recede. 3 months after their first meeting, Daniel wrote that he would have a week's leave and asked if he might visit. Grace's hands trembled as she penned her reply, yes, he would be most welcome. She spent the days before his arrival in a flurry of cleaning and baking, then chided herself for acting like a lovesick girl. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter in her heart when, exactly when expected, she saw a rider approaching from the west. Daniel's face broke into a wide smile when he saw her waiting by the gate. He dismounted quickly and stood before her, hat in hand, suddenly shy. "You're a sight for sore eyes, Grace Jennings," he said softly. "As are you, Daniel Yates," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. That visit sealed what both had begun to suspect through their correspondence. They had found in each other something rare and precious. Daniel spoke of his intentions to leave the nomadic life behind, to put down roots somewhere. The question of where hung between them, unasked, but ever present. On his last evening, as they walked beside the creek that bordered Grace's property, Daniel finally found the courage to speak what was in his heart. "Grace, I know it hasn't been that long since we met, and even less time that we've spent in each other's company. But I find myself thinking of you constantly." He took her hands in his. "I've fallen in love with you." Grace's heart soared at his words. "And I with you, Daniel. It frightens me how quickly it happened, but I can't deny it." "I don't want to rush you," he said earnestly. "I know you're still healing from your loss, but I need you to know where I stand and what I hope for." "Tell me," Grace whispered. "When my contract ends in 3 months, I want to come back here, not just to visit but to stay, if you'll have me." Daniel's eyes were earnest and vulnerable. "I want to build a life with you, Grace." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "I want that too." Daniel brushed a tear from her cheek. "Are you certain? I don't want to be something you settle for out of necessity or loneliness." "You could never be that," Grace assured him. "What I feel for you is different from what I felt for Thomas. Not less, just different. Is that wrong?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "Love isn't meant to be compared that way. Thomas will always be part of your heart, as he should be. But there's room there for something new, something that belongs to us alone." Grace nodded, relieved by his understanding. "Then yes, Daniel Yates, when you return in 3 months, I want you to stay." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a passion that took her breath away. When they finally parted, both were trembling. 3 months, Daniel said, touching her cheek. "It will feel like forever." "We've both endured longer waits for less reward," Grace reminded him with a smile. "We'll manage." The 3 months passed slowly for Grace, filled with preparations and planning. She wrote to the preacher in town, inquiring discreetly about remarriage. She added touches to the cabin that she thought Daniel might appreciate: a larger bookshelf, a second rocking chair on the porch. Each change to accommodate another person in her life felt like an act of faith. Doubt sometimes crept in during the long nights. Was she betraying Thomas's memory? Was she rushing into something out of fear of facing life alone? But always, when she read Daniel's letters, those doubts receded. What they had found was real and worth embracing. December arrived with bitter winds and the promise of snow. The day Daniel was due to return dawned clear but frigid. Grace had been up since before dawn, too nervous and excited to sleep. She kept busy with chores, then changed into her best dress, not black this time, but a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. When she heard hoofbeats approaching, she stepped onto the porch, heart hammering. Daniel appeared, his breath visible in the cold air, his face alight with joy at the sight of her. He practically leapt from his horse and bounded up the steps to gather her in his arms. "Grace," he breathed against her hair. "My Grace." "You're here," she whispered, scarcely believing it despite the solid reality of him in her arms. "I'm here," he confirmed. "For good, if you'll still have me." Grace led him inside, where a fire crackled welcomingly and the table was set for 2. Over supper, Daniel shared his news: his honorable discharge from his army contract, his savings carefully put aside, his plans for expanding her cattle operation with horses as well. "Our operation," Grace corrected gently. "If we're to be partners in life, we'll be partners in all things." Daniel reached across the table to take her hand. "I want to do this properly," he said. From his pocket, he produced a small wooden box. "It's not fancy," he apologized, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "But it's solid, like what I hope our life together will be." Grace's eyes filled with tears as he slipped from his chair to one knee beside her. "Grace Jennings, will you marry me? Will you let me share your sorrows and joys, your work and your rest, for all the days we're given?" "Yes," Grace said through happy tears. "With all my heart, yes." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in town. The preacher spoke of second chances and God's grace in bringing healing after loss. Grace wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, with sprigs of dried lavender in her hair. Daniel, in a new suit bought for the occasion, looked at her as though she were the most precious thing he'd ever beheld. The townspeople who attended were genuinely happy for Grace. Even those who had once looked at her with calculating eyes now saw the obvious love between the couple and could only wish them well. After the simple ceremony, they returned to what was now their home. As Daniel carried her over the threshold, Grace felt the last shadows of grief give way to the brightness of new beginnings. That night, as they lay tangled together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Daniel traced the contour of her face with gentle fingers. "I used to wonder if I'd ever find a place that felt like home again," he murmured. "Now I know home isn't a place at all, it's a person, it's you, Grace." Grace nestled closer to him. "When Thomas died, I thought my heart had stopped forever. You made it beat again." "We've both been given a second chance," Daniel said. "I intend to make the most of every day of it." As spring returned to the Wyoming Territory, the changes to the Jennings-Yates homestead were visible to anyone who passed by. A new corral had been built for the horses Daniel had brought with him. The barn had been expanded, the vegetable garden doubled in size. Most noticeable was the new addition being built onto the cabin, 2 rooms that would eventually become nurseries. Grace placed a protective hand over her slightly rounded belly as she watched Daniel working on the roof of the addition. 5 months married, and already they were preparing for the child that would arrive by fall. The news had brought both of them immeasurable joy, though Grace had worried briefly about complications given her age of 27. "The Hanson women have babies into their 40s, Daniel had reassured her, referring to his mother's family. "And they're all healthy as horses. Our child will be strong, just like their mother." The sound of approaching riders drew Grace's attention. She shaded her eyes, recognizing Sheriff Miller and another man from town. "Daniel," she called, "we have visitors." Daniel climbed down from the roof and joined her, placing a protective arm around her waist as the men approached. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Daniel greeted. "What brings you out our way?" Sheriff Miller removed his hat respectfully. "Good news, actually. You remember that band of rustlers that hit the Peterson place last month? We caught them trying the same thing over in Carbon County." "That is good news," Daniel agreed. "Did you recover any of the stolen cattle?" "Some," the sheriff nodded, "and that's partly why we're here." "One of the rustlers had information about cattle stolen from this property last year." Grace stiffened. "From our ranch when?" "Last winter, madam, right after your first husband passed." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Seems they thought the place would be easy pickings with Mr. Jennings gone. They made off with about 20 head from your south pasture." Grace felt Daniel's arm tighten around her. "We never even noticed," she said quietly, "with everything else happening." "Exactly what they counted on," the sheriff said grimly. "But here's the thing, we recovered 13 head that match the brand registered to this ranch. They're being held at the county seat. They're yours if you want to claim them." Daniel and Grace exchanged a look of amazement. That's wonderful news," Daniel said. "We'll certainly claim them." After the sheriff left, promising to send word when the cattle could be collected, Grace and Daniel sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. "It feels like a gift from Thomas somehow," Grace said softly. "Those cattle he worked so hard to raise coming back to us now." Daniel nodded, understanding. "A blessing on our future from your past." Grace leaned against his shoulder. "I used to think happiness was something you earned once and kept forever. Now I know it's something you can lose and find again, sometimes in the most unexpected places." "Like a well in the middle of nowhere," Daniel said, kissing the top of her head. "Like a stranger who drew water and spoke my name," Grace agreed. As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, making plans for their growing family and the legacy they would build together. The cattle would return, the baby would arrive, and life would continue its beautiful, unpredictable journey. And it all began with a widow who sat in silence at a well, and a cowboy who drew water and spoke her name.